Welcome to Frontlines. We'd like to welcome our viewers once again from across the United States and Canada, from Europe and the Middle East, and of course in Armenia and Artsakh. It has been a watershed week, in a week or two, frankly. First, the appointment of government representatives to address Turkish-Armenian relations, and the removal of the Yerevan mayor and his retort that the prime minister has abandoned the values of the revolution. And then the Armenian prime minister's comments about Artsakh would set shockwaves through Armenian society and drew vociferous rebukes from across the Armenian world, including from the government of Artsakh, the president, the foreign minister, the National Assembly, ombudsman in Stepanakert and Yerevan, all sounding an alarm and reaffirming Artsakh's right to self-determination. There's a lot in motion, and really all at the same time. And today we're going to try to unpack some of these developments and try to understand why we're at these crossroads, how we got here, and frankly, where we are headed. And with that, I'd like to pass it off to Garo to introduce our guest for this evening.
Thank you, Karnig. Good evening, everyone in the United States. Good morning, everyone in Armenia and Artsakh, and good day elsewhere around the globe. I am pleased to welcome our guest at this program, Dr. Irina Ghaplanyan, and I'm pleased to introduce her to you, our fellow audience. Dr. Irina Ghaplanyan, the former Deputy Minister of Environment of the Republic of Armenia and Senior Advisor of the World Bank Group, is our guest at this moment. She is a political scientist, climate negotiator, and a published author. Dr. Ghaplanyan holds a doctorate degree in political science from the University of Cambridge, a master's degree in diplomatic studies from the Diplomatic Academy of London, and a Bachelor of Arts degree in international relations from the University of Malta. Her areas of expertise include political leadership, states in transition, climate politics, environmental management, gender and gender in conflict, as well as security studies. Dr. Ghaplanyan has served as Deputy Minister of Environment for the Republic of Armenia between 2018 and 2020. She is currently a senior advisor on climate change to the World Bank Group and functions in her capacity as an international expert on climate change to the FAO. She also teaches at the American University of Armenia. Our guest has worked in a number of international organizations and think tanks around the world, including UNDP, Georgetown University, Eurasia Foundation, and Chatham House. She has been a catalyst for change in the field of sustainable business and social entrepreneurship in Armenia and was noted for her work in this field. In 2015, Dr. Ghaplanyan was recognized as one of the top social venture entrepreneurs by the Global Fund Leadership Program in Washington, D.C. Last, but certainly not least, our guest has a number of academic and media publications, among which the most recent is a Routledge-published book titled Post-Soviet Armenia, The New National Elite and the New National Narrative. Dr. Ghaplanyan, welcome to Frontlines.
Thank you.
Karnig?
Yes, Irina, I want to start by taking you back a few years. I watched a presentation you gave at USC about 3 years ago. It's a number of other government officials. At the time, you were Deputy Minister of the Environment. And you spoke about what the Velvet Revolution was about in some respects. And you said something really interesting. You said it was about human security, is the phrase that you used. You highlighted economic, social, environmental. And my question is this, and in the context of the developments since the trilateral statement, did those that came into power, in your opinion, at that time, did they have a clear Artsakh policy at the time? And if so, what were the contours of that policy, do you think?
Thank you, Karnig, for a very interesting question, taking me back to 3 years when I prepared this talk and gave it to USC. I think when we compare what was in 2018, at the beginning, the expectations of the people who drove the political changes and what popularly became dubbed as Velvet Revolution have largely, over the course of 3 years, not been met. And I will elaborate further on that. But going back to the roots of why the changes occurred and why they brought to essentially the revolution and change in the government is a breaking of trust. If you analyze over the course of the last years of Sarkisyan's administration, there was a clear communication from the head of state at the time that constitutional changes in Armenia will not lead to him staying in power. And I think that is a very strong statement by the head of state at the time, undertaking massive changes to the very essential body of law in the country, that is the Constitution. He was on record in 2014 and 2015 stating that he will not be ascending to power once again. He was on record a year prior to 2018 that he will not ascend to power. And when eventually the public saw that he is intended to do that, it was a fundamental break of trust. And why I want to specifically highlight that is because across the 30 years of different administrations leading a post-Soviet Armenia, we have continuously seen that breaking of trust when it comes to the very basic security aspect of the population of Armenia. The health security, social security, environmental security, and I hope we'll have a chance to elaborate on that, and the exploitation of Armenia's natural resources at the expense of the population, both the health and the well-being of the population. So fundamentally, we have seen continuous iterations of the break of trust. And what had transpired in 2018 is specifically that a very straightforward break of trust from the head of state who committed to undertaking fundamental reforms to the Constitution of Armenia and then didn't keep his word. It was very, very simple, the break of trust that led to this massive mobilization. And in my another talk, in fact, where I stressed the participation of women in the revolution of 2018, one of the successes that had led eventually to that strong mobilization is decentralization of the movement in the spring of 2018. And to summarize the question, I think when we look at what had transpired in the past 3 years, when it comes to Artsakh, when this new administration came to power, one of the biggest assets it had at the very inception of its rule, of its power in Armenia, was giving that very trust. And the fundamental principle of trust is transparency, something that we have seen gradually wane in the past 3 years as this administration has been in power. Both trust has been broken, and more importantly, the fundamental aspect of trust, that is the transparency and clear communication with the population of what is intended to be done on Artsakh, how it is intended to be done, and what is the basic strategy and vision of this current leadership when it comes to Artsakh and Artsakh's future.
You know, it kind of takes the thunder out of what I thought was going to be my question, and I wondered if you answered it. You were Deputy Minister of Environment from 2018 to 2020. You left your post. I assume you left your post because you're no longer in that post. Would you agree that security, which appears to be, in my opinion, one of the biggest concerns that we've had since the 44-day war in late 2020, remains as the primary challenge for Armenia, for Artsakh in 2022? And how does that play into your having left your position in government? Why did you leave your position in government? Do you agree that security is one of the biggest challenges? And we can talk from there as to what we can do about it.
Absolutely. Fully echoing your statement that security is fundamental to Armenia's resilience, but more importantly, what is fundamental is understanding and having a vision of how we acquire that security, how we make it resilient, and how do we get there. Now, coming back to the question as to why I left my post, there is an external and internal agency to my decision as to why I decided to leave a position that was of great importance for me, both when it comes to public posts serving my people, and also to the capacity that I and my team brought to the environmental and climate agenda of Armenia. I think over the course of 2.5 years that Eric Grigorian, myself, and our team were in the position, we have done a fundamentally strong and we projected a very strong climate and environmentally sound policies. In Armenia, we implemented multiple reforms in various aspects of environmental management, and I hope I'll come to that. But to answer your question on my decision to leave, well, unfortunately, Eric Grigorian, who was the Minister of Environment at the time, who brought me into the team, he had left a few months earlier. That was May of 2020. And considering that we were, so to speak, a technocratic team, he was not, never was a member of any political party, nor was I. For us, having that public post was a clear agenda of the reforms that we had to undertake. And when Eric left, it was a natural continuation for me to also leave the team that I was a part of. So that was the internal agency that contributed to my decision leaving. And I stayed on for a few months after he left to ensure that there was a good transition of institutional memory and knowledge to the next team that would come to govern the ministry. The external agency to my decision, of course, was the war. The 44 days and how the war was managed by the current administration fundamentally was in disagreement with my principles and my views on how government should react, how diplomacy should be conducted, and how from combat to diplomacy and strategic communication, I disagreed with everything that was done by this administration. And I am being very straightforward by saying everything. And I can further elaborate on that. Hence, having a strong disagreement, and after all, deputy minister is a high-level political post, I felt the strong need that I had to leave the post, in addition to the internal agency of Minister Grigorian having left already.
If I may follow up quickly, let me bring you back to the security issue and reminding our audience that you are an environmental expert, an activist with credentials, if you will. What do you make of the global environmental disregard for environmental issues? And I'm specifically referring to Europe, given the fact that one of the countries, primarily Azerbaijan, I'm not referring to Turkey at the moment, being an oil-producing country, and the European countries having an interest in having the product reach, their territories, very well turned not just a blind eye, but two blind eyes, if you will, to what went on in Artsakh. And what can be done to tighten the noose around these reckless, in my opinion, European governments who would sell out human rights, would sell out life and limb for Azerbaijani oil? Is there something that could be done from the environmental activism perspective in this regard to improve overall the security of Armenia, which is very vulnerable because obviously, in my opinion at least, the European nation has done very little other than lip service?
Thank you, Garo. In answering that question, let me just frame it in a wider context of things. I think when looking at the mute policy of the European Union and certain member states to what had transpired in Nagorno-Karabakh, we have to, and generally when we talk about any type of resource politics, I think we have to be very honest and clear with ourselves that politics has for centuries been driven by natural resources. If for over a century it was driven by fossil fuels, it continues to be driven by fossil fuels. So that is a fundamental objective reality. And our starting point in understanding how to address European nations is accepting that reality. And if yesterday it was fossil fuel, it was oil and gas, tomorrow it will be water, and it is water already. And I could argue that one of the reasons and the timing of the war that Azerbaijan started in fall of 2020 was water and water scarcity in this region. So we need to fundamentally accept the objective reality that politics revolves around the management of natural resources, or who will have the grip on the natural resources that drive the economy. And for a century, it was the fossil fuels, and wars largely occurred because of fossil fuels and the control over them. And politics does revolve around it. And I think the best testament of that is climate change and how difficult it is for countries to agree around a certain agenda. And science has been out there for 4 to 5 decades, proving that fossil fuels, the burning of fossil fuels is leading to the warming of the planet. For 4 decades, science has been there, but the real action is still yet to be seen by the strongest and the largest polluters. Only now we're seeing strong and ambitious statements and agendas coming out of the European Union with European Green Deal. But even then, when we look at the carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emission reduction per capita in the European capitals, it's still a lot less than what they potentially could do. And then we look at the United States. I mean, the United States withdrew from the entire process in 2016 when Trump came to power. Trump's administration was very vocal about, denying science when it comes to climate change. So it's very, very clear that that climate change agenda is the best testament to how countries and the global political leaders know exactly where we're headed with the warming of the planet. The action certainly doesn't meet the challenge of the warming of the planet and what is yet to come when it comes to climate catastrophes and water scarcity that we're going to see in the coming decades. So with that being said, I think Armenia has largely failed in structuring a sound foreign policy for projecting its agenda to the world, and particularly to the European nations. I mean, where do we stand as a country when it comes to Artsakh? And this is something that is a failure not only of this administration. You earlier asked me about Artsakh policy. It's a failure of all of the previous administrations, because unfortunately, Artsakh was used more for an internal agency, that is to keep power domestically, to use war and to use the conflict of Nagorno-Karabakh to ascend and hold on to power, as opposed to really find not necessarily a solution between Armenia and Azerbaijan over this, but find a solution for Armenia to achieve the rights of the people of Artsakh self-determination. And I believe, and I strongly believe, and I can certainly back up with further argumentation, that previous administration and current administration have dramatically failed in projecting what Armenia wants when it comes to Artsakh, how it plans to achieve it, and hence it never had a clear strategy and an action plan and a roadmap how we get there. And one of those is the failure to invoke any type of international legal instrumentary when it comes to fighting for the rights of self-determination of the people of Artsakh. So again, wrapping up the answer to this question, I think we have to first take a look at a larger perspective of how global politics is run, and that is by fossil fuels and natural resources. And we hence have to structure our approach to global powers with that objective reality in mind. And of course, when it comes to the internal agency, we have largely failed in articulating a vision, a strategy, and acting on a roadmap that would lead us to having a sound policy and an outcome when it comes to Artsakh.
Irina, I want to dig in on something you said in the beginning of the response to Garo's question, which struck me as pretty interesting, and that was about the timing of the war and an argument you said regarding water resources. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more? What is your argument there? What did timing have to do with natural resources, timing of the war?
Oh, absolutely. I think the international media has largely overlooked what had transpired in Azerbaijan in 2020 when it comes to domestic crises. In spring and in summer of 2020, the Kura River dropped by 2 meters in Azerbaijan. The Minget-Chavir Reservoir dropped by, which is the largest water reservoir in the South Caucasus, dropped by about 60 meters. And there were reports coming out of Baku that the water shortages led to shutting down of water in the capital of Azerbaijan, in Baku, for hours, and it would be accessible only for 2 hours per day. So I think that's something that international media has largely ignored or did not take note of. But that's a strong reality on the ground, where you have domestic population already unhappy with multiple issues, from the fact that it is a dictatorship that's pocketing the country's wealth to there were reports on 2020 that the poorest population in the region is actually Azerbaijan when it comes to per capita. Yet when you look at the natural resources, it is the wealthiest nation. So there are multiple aspects why the population of Azerbaijan is disenchanted with its dictatorial leadership. And yet another aspect, of course, had led to, in my opinion, and I can further argue that, for Azerbaijani authorities to make a decision to time the war when they did. Of course, there were other objective and external factors to that. The elections in the United States, the COVID that distracted most of the global leadership. And it was perfect timing for Azerbaijan to initiate this war with the support of Turkey, and of course the domestic issues, the domestic disenchantment with the leadership of Azerbaijan. And there is also another dimension: the fact that energy prices were very volatile in 2020, and considering that Azerbaijan's domestic energy production is 82% dependent on fossil fuels, they have for years tried to diversify their water resources, but Azerbaijan is the most scarce country when it comes to water resources in this region. And they want to diversify at the expense of hydropower. And as we know, Artsakh had 37 hydropower plants before the war, and Artsakh has been the single entity in this region whose energy demands were fully met by renewable resources, and that is hydropower, with 37 hydropower plants operating on the territory of Artsakh. So this was very clear, and it is becoming clear that one of the reasons that Azerbaijan timed this war, particularly at the time that it did, one of the reasons contributing to that timing was water scarcity. And the post-war developments also further reinforced this argument when we saw that Azerbaijan immediately engaged with Iran on negotiations over the Ghazarin reservoir. And then we also saw the I can't specifically point, I think it was February or March, when they did the opening of a hydropower plant, major hydropower plant that they captured from Artsakh. So I think a lot of pre-war and post-war developments further reinforced that water was one of the considerations for Azerbaijan to initiate this war.
Yeah, go ahead.
Karnig, for a minute. Let's stay on this subject. 2 weeks ago, Dr. Ghaplanyan, you posted on your social media page about the UN Security Council resolution linking climate change to international peace and security. And you pointed out that the Russian ambassador, Vasily Nebenzia, raised his hand to veto it while China abstained. And you went on and said that in defense of its veto, Russia argued that the resolution, if adopted, would politicize a scientific and economic issue. And in your opinion, I took it to be your opinion, that with this logic, Russia should have never become a party to the Paris Agreement, And you concluded by saying that climate is the most political issue on the global agenda today, because it's not only about cutting global emissions, but also about keeping fossil fuels in the ground. It kind of made me think Russia is the security guarantor of Artsakh today. I no longer think it's Armenia, not even by a long shot. Are we safe enough? And I go back to the security issue, that when you have the Russian ambassador vetoing, raising his hand, are the people of Artsakh, is the Republic of Artsakh secure enough with the Russian peacekeepers ensuring its safety and sovereignty, what's left of it, if you will, given this kind of behavior, this kind of representation, this kind of manifest, partial and self-serving interests, if you will?
Garo, in answering your question, I think I will compartmentalize it into two. First of all, Russia's position when it comes to climate politics and where Russia stands. And then, of course, the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh and current peacekeeping forces. The way Russia vetoed was largely forecast and predicted, considering where Russia stands on climate politics, and considering specifically this very hard truth, that is that when you commit to Paris Agreement, we talk a lot about the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but largely we ignore the more painful reality that about 60% or more of the currently produced fossil fuels have to stay in the ground if we are to achieve net zero world in the next few decades. And that is more difficult than mitigating and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because so many economies, including Russia's economy, depend on fossil fuels. But the problem is not necessarily, and it was Poland actually who brought forward to the UNFCCC Secretariat, that is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat, the concept of just transition. I mean, as you know, Poland is the black sheep of Europe. I mean, it is one of the most heavily dependent country on fossil fuels, and at that on coal. So Poland hosted COP24 in 2018, and it introduced the concept of just transition, arguing that countries who have strong dependency on fossil fuels have to be given a different timeline of weaning off of their dependency on fossil fuel. So just to argue the position that there are multiple formulas and instrumentary available within the UNFCCC Secretariat to help countries to transition to net zero, especially those that have high dependency on fossil fuels. The problem, though, with countries like Russia is that for years you had very strong dependency. The entire economy, if you will, has a Dutch disease when it comes to dependency on fossil fuels in particular. But more importantly, Russia has for years used fossil fuels as it's soft, well, hard, or not necessarily hard power, but soft power when it comes to achieving what it wants politically, right? Whether it has to do with South Caucasus and the way Russia structured its energy relations with Armenia, with the European Union, how Russia is structuring its relationship with the European Union when it comes to natural gas. I mean, Russia clearly is able to achieve a lot of things because of its fossil fuels. So it's not simply a resource, and I'm coming back to my original argument. Fossil fuels and resources are inherently very, very political. And Russia has relied on those not simply to build its economy, but to project a certain foreign policy and achieve what it wants. So Russia is one of the wealthiest countries in the world when it comes to natural resources. I mean, it is the vastest country when it comes to territory globally. So had it structured its economy properly in terms of distribution, you know, Russia had full potential to become heavily renewable in the 30 years of its independence. However, that wasn't a priority for the country. Now, what we need to realize is for Russia, it's not about natural resources that it lacks or doesn't lack, or it has an abundance. It's about fossil fuels continuing to be an instrument of foreign policy. That is why it is very important. And that is why Russia clearly argues that it wants to stay away from politicizing this issue, something that it has done for decades, right? Now, coming back to the situation on the ground in Nagorno-Karabakh, with all due respect and objectivity, I think if it wasn't for Russia's peacekeeping forces on the ground, the rest of Artsakh would be ethnically cleansed. So I think we have to make sure that we give due when it comes to what Russia had done in the last days of the war, including the attempts to mediate the conflict earlier and find a solution. So if it wasn't for the Russian peacekeeping forces currently standing there, the rest of the population of Artsakh would have been ethnically cleansed. However, I think moving forward, it is absolutely paramount, and there has to be a clear strategy with Moscow to negotiate a more diversified contingent for peacekeepers in Artsakh. And as ambitious and unrealistic that sounds, I think one of the failures of Armenia's foreign policy and foreign policy institutions, if you will, has always been, well, the real world out there is more rigid and difficult than you think, so we shouldn't even attempt. I think one of the failures of lack of Artsakh policy is to clearly structuring when and how we believe the population of Artsakh will be secure, and we will be able to soundly structure the path towards self-determination and eventual independence of Artsakh. And that starts from realization what is currently happening on the ground, how Russian peacekeeping forces are protecting, and using the current documents that we have at hand to ensure that we bring more security, and that has to do absolutely with diversifying the peacekeeping contingent. And if we structure and argue this in a sound fashion, sitting at the table with Russian diplomats, I think Russia will be even more incentivized to consider this, because should we take this to an international level, should we take it to the Security Council, it will become by default a justification and international recognition of Russia as a peacekeeping nation in Nagorno-Karabakh, something that is currently not the case and hasn't been done before. So there are benefits that Russia can reap, but those benefits have to be structured, packaged, delivered, and communicated by Armenia for Artsakh, and to make Artsakh more secure, as Garo, you mentioned. Unfortunately, currently Armenia does not provide that vital security on the ground.
You know, Irina, in a follow-up to that, one of our viewers has asked a pretty interesting and specific question on our social media feed, asking what your reaction is to the government's comment that 30% of Sivlich is not worth fighting for. Given what you just said about water security, what are your thoughts? I mean, because as you were talking through kind of the big picture items, there were many, and I'm sure many of our viewers too, were thinking of specific instances, you know, whether in the aftermath of the war, in terms of encroachment on borders, that we see, you know, the focus on hilltops, on water resources. How does, you know, in specific Sivlich, and perhaps other examples if you can give of how that policy continues to be carried out?
I think, thank you for the question. And yes, absolutely. In post-war continuation of fighting over water resources, Sivlich is another major example. And when we talk about Sivlich, I mean, and the government's response that 30% of Sivlich is not worth fighting for is a very unfortunate reduction to resolution of any type of conflict to a combat. And here I see multiple avenues where this situation could be resolved. One being a reference to the very Soviet maps to which Moscow and Kremlin constantly refer to, from a position of a mediator and from an authoritative position, if you will, stating that only we have certain maps that showcase where the demarcation delimitation is or should be. When it comes to Sivlich, there is multiple evidence that most of it's been under administration of the Soviet Armenia at the time. There was only a fraction of that under Azerbaijan. The same with Karabakh. I mean, when we look at the Soviet era maps, most of the water management in Karabakh, because Karabakh supplied a lot of agricultural lands in Armenia, most of the water management was done by Armenian Soviet authorities at the time. So there are many ways by which Armenian government could offer a resolution or could start negotiating. Simply reducing it to combat is a trap or an easy way out to try and avoid any further confrontation. And the objective reality is indeed that Armenia lost in the Artsakh War of 2020, and Azerbaijan, it's not simply negotiating from a position of power, it's borderizing the current process, right? Knowing that Armenia is weak. But considering that we have Russia as a mediator, considering that we have a number of agreements, both past and current in terms of trilateral statement, Armenia can do much more diplomacy when it comes to issues like that. And I strongly believe that stating that 30% of Sevlij is not worth fighting for is a very defeatist and dangerous statement by the government.
So there are two areas that I want to go into. One of them is your assessment of what our dear friend Yelisha Giragosyan and his team, including Karnig here and others, did and delivered at the ICJ at The Hague not too long ago. I was curious about what you meant when you said the true implications of the provisional measures by the ICJ will depend on whether and how Armenia will use the order as a tool in its offensive legal diplomacy. That's my first question.
Okay. Which are you referring to? In one of my social media posts?
So you talked about that the orders were overwhelmingly in Armenia's favor, and of course, in short, the ups are that Armenia's 4 provisional measures were met. We have the jurisdiction, and essentially none of the Azerbaijan's requests for provisional measures were met. But the downs were that the served as a convention had limited instrumentary for the World Court to order the return of our POWs, and that's where I want to go to.
Yes. Thank you for clarification, Garo. So yes, absolutely. I think indeed the court order was unprecedented as it set a new precedent, particularly when it comes to the protection of cultural heritage. And when I spoke of offensive diplomacy and offensive instrumentary, right now, we have immense evidence that Azerbaijan had engaged in systematic destruction of Armenian cultural heritage. And this is not only in the scope and the context of the most recent war. We've seen a complete annihilation of any trace or remnant of Armenian cultural and religious heritage in Nakhichevan. So this carries a systemic nature. And we've seen time and again that a UN body that is called by its functions to protect this type of heritage, unfortunately fails dramatically in undertaking its functions effectively, and that is UNESCO. So with this court order, particularly setting the precedent, a new precedent, where a given entity can take its grievances beyond the UN body that's charged with this function, taking it all the way up to the UN Security Council. This is exactly what I meant when I referred to offensive diplomacy. Obviously, Azerbaijan will not refrain from continued destruction of Armenian cultural heritage, and there are multiple organizations that are currently watching on the ground, not on the ground, through the GIS technology on what is transpiring on the occupied parts of Artsakh and other territories where we have Armenian cultural and religious heritage. Once a substantive evidence is gathered, Armenia has the full right, based on the newly set precedent, to use the instrumentary and take its grievances up to the UN Security Council. Something Armenia actually had for a while, not particularly pertaining to the cultural and religious heritage, but generally to Azerbaijan's incursion on Armenia's territory, Armenian proper territory. Since May of this year, we've seen multiple incursions, including the most recent in November. So Armenia did have the opportunity to invoke its rights under the respective articles of the UN Charter and request a UN Security Council. But obviously, for that type of instrumentary to be invoked, you have to do a lot of backdoor diplomacy and negotiations in order to make sure that your attempt has a chance to succeed.
I have one more question. I'll hold it. Karnig, please go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask I want to get to the Turkish-Armenian relations issue in a second in terms of diplomacy, but I wanted to come back to one point that you had raised earlier regarding hydroelectric, regarding Artsakh self-sustainability prior to the 2020 war. Is there a security issue now from a natural resources perspective with respect to Armenia because of what was lost in Artsakh? And I say that because my understanding was that there was quite a bit of export going on from Artsakh to Armenia of energy resources. Is this an issue that is now going to be increasingly front and center for Armenia going forward?
Well, I think what we need to, in response to the question, I will look at, I will zoom out and look at the region in general. I mean, the South Caucasus region is considered one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change in this part of the world, and namely because of a number of climatic conditions specific to this region. When it comes to Armenia, because we're landlocked, we have 4 different climatic zones in this country. We're that much more vulnerable to the increasing temperatures globally. Armenia already has registered 1.3 degrees Celsius increase in temperatures. That is coupled with 9% decrease in precipitation. So all of the forecasts and scenarios that have been done for Armenia, we're seeing about 55% reduction of water in the country over the course of the next 2 decades. I mean, that is fundamentally a massive hit to Armenia's economy, considering that a significant portion of our economy does depend on agriculture, and we continue to invest into agriculture. So that's in a larger context of things, that water will become a very, very sought after resource in this region. And any loss of any potential water resource is a massive economic loss, not, of course, in addition to the security dimension. And then when we look at Azerbaijan, their forecasts are even more dire, because Azerbaijan in our region is the most scarce region when it comes to water resources, the most scarce country when it comes to water resources. Their projections go over 70%, close to 80% of reduction in agricultural yield in the next few decades because of the drop in water resources and increasing temperatures. So that is a major security issue for Azerbaijan, and hence it was a strategic decision for them to acquire as many water resources as possible. And they will not be backing down from self-leach, considering the forecasts and scenarios for Azerbaijan. This is a matter of security for them. It's not simply territorial acquisition. So we need to keep that in mind. And when it comes to Armenia's disadvantage, I think we need to look at the disadvantage again from a regional perspective, the fight for the natural resources that will sustain the growth and resilience of our economies, both in Artsakh and Armenia. This is what we need to be focusing on, and also projecting to the world that this region is scarce in water resources, and essentially the water wars will be something in not so distant future. And this, of course, can be scaled into the wider context of things. We're seeing what Turkey is doing on its territory, affecting downstream countries like Iraq and Iran. I mean, last year, one of the leader of Iran, Ayatollah, made a very strong statement addressed to Turkey, calling Turkey a praying, basically framing that or defining Turkish politics as that of preying on water resources of the region. And the countries like Iran, Iraq, and Syria have been experiencing drought, not only because of the drop in precipitation and water flows, but also because of a very aggressive strategy of Turkey building dams all across its border, capturing most of these water resources that flow downstream. So this is a larger context of things that we need to look into, and considering that Armenia is so heavily invested in developing its agriculture, it is through and through a security matter for us to secure as much as possible our water resources.
From the climate crisis to nuclear war and technological disruption, the future of security reassessed. I see you there, having stated on the eve of the COP26 summit, you wrote, "We need to rethink our models of leadership and re-examine our understanding of human security to deal with the existential threats we face." So my question immediately was, well, that's a mouthful for me. What do you mean by that? Leadership, rethink our models of leadership. Are you talking about leadership of Armenia, leadership of the cause, the issue in terms of climate change? What are you talking about?
I'm talking about mostly of transparency in decision-making processes and in listening to science. I mean, I earlier noted that for 4 decades, we have been aware, mostly political leadership globally has been aware of the warming of the planet, and that essentially we're heading, if we continue doing business as usual, we're headed towards a doomsday. Obviously, it won't occur overnight as predicted in the most recent Hollywood movie, Don't Look Up. We won't be hit by an asteroid and the world won't be destroyed overnight, but we're definitely on a collision course when it comes to the warming of the planet and the compounding effect of the climate change. That is the events that will be occurring with more intensity, with more scalability. And I mean, if we look at the prognosis of doing business as usual when it comes to climate, we're seeing things like water wars, we're seeing things like wars over resources, climate refugees. So we are on a collision course, and unless we start planning now and listening to science now, we are going to fail in the next few decades, passing on to next generations a sustainable and resilient planet. And we're already scratching the surface of what is to come in the next few decades should we not live up to our promises that developed and developing countries have given in the framework of Paris Agreement. So when I talk about rethinking the leadership models, I think from Artsakh to water resource management, when we zoom into Armenia, there needs to be more transparency. There needs to be less populism. There needs to be hardcore real life politics and explanation to its populace what we are facing and how we're going to resolve this together. Unfortunately, for the past 4 or 5 years, the world has been fraught with politics that's driven by populism, further exacerbated and instrumentalized by social media, reduced to sound bites. There's very little depth to understanding politics, understanding policy production, and what really is needed for countries to make a fundamental change and put countries on a fundamental course of fixing the problems, not exploiting them for gaining office and power. Something we're seeing, across developed and developing nations. And this is a trap that we need to realize it is. And the sooner we realize, the earlier we will get out of that and demand a stronger and more accountable and a leadership that's driven by evidence and science as opposed to populism and clickbaits.
I couldn't agree with you more. Karnig, go to.
I think that's a great.
Go ahead.
I think it's a great transition to allow us to change gears, if we can, Irina, to what's happening today. And I'm going to really kind of draw on your diplomatic training in this context, and that's the recent developments in Armenian-Turkish relations. And I don't want to poison the well. I just want to throw it out there as an open-ended question and really get your thoughts. You've highlighted a few themes that you feel are important. One of which, of course, is transparency. You mentioned following the science, and in this case, perhaps following some history is also important. What are your views about? Well, two things. One, what are your views on the process that seems to have been initiated? And secondly, what do you think substantively what's really happening? What's going on? How much of this is substantive change, and how much of it is procedural dynamics?
Thank you, Karnig. I think I will divide it into two parts, one related to the process and the other to the substance. When we talk about the process, certainly there's nothing new to it. From the first administration, that is Levon Ter-Petrosyan's, who was most vested in developing relations with Turkey and opening the border, to Serge Sarkisyan and current administration that when it came to power basically stated that they will stay on the course of foreign policy that was adopted by previous administration. I mean, Pashinyan's team has projected that narrative time and time again, I think more geared towards Kremlin than any other center of power, but certainly something that was reverberated across the foreign policy positions of this administration. So when it comes to process, Armenia has not really changed its courses, and Armenia's different administrations articulated that it is open to engage with Turkey without any preconditions. And we famously remember the famous process of football diplomacy, where Armenia came the closest to any type of resolution. But this is when we actually saw that in the last minute, it was Turkey who brought additional preconditions. And if we dig a little bit deeper, I don't think this was initiated in Ankara. I certainly believe that there were processes that led to this tabling of new preconditions from Baku, and it was in vested interest of Baku to prevent any type of normalization of the relations between Armenia and Turkey at the time when Armenia had a stronger position to negotiate. So we know that the process has always been there, and throughout the 30 years, including this current administration. So now that the two capitals agreed to table its positions and continue the process, there's nothing new. What has changed is the substance of where Armenia stands as a country. It has been defeated. It is currently weak. It is not able to negotiate from the position of power. And I think this is a dangerous game that we are engaging in, considering also that on our side, we don't have experienced diplomats who will be negotiating with Turkey. When we look at the Turkish team led by a very, very experienced diplomat, and generally Turkish diplomacy that is a consolidated and strong institution that has a clear culture and style of negotiations, and we compare to our team currently, I think there's a massive disbalance of power. So when it comes to substance, I am very wary of where we're headed to, because, as I said, Armenia is not negotiating from a position of power. Turkey is known for its diplomatic style of putting forth very, very high positions. And if you know how to negotiate with Turkey, you know that if Turkish position is here at the table, then more likely they're here. And you need to negotiate it down to more realistic position for you. But then if you're not in a position of power, if you don't have a strong diplomatic team, you're most likely not able to achieve that, nor realize and get acquainted to the Turkish style of negotiations. With that being said, I think since we're already engaged in this process, there needs to be full support of the current team that will be negotiating. The question is, are they ready to receive the necessary support and a consultation and advising from people who know and understand how Ankara negotiates? That's the question.
Karnig, this reminds me, what you just said, Irina, reminded me of what happened 2008, shortly after 2008. What you said any self-respecting Armenian cannot disagree with. We need to, support the effort. After all, it is an effort on behalf of the nation. The problem I have is this. Levon Ter-Bedrosian was in power. Serge Sarkisian comes into power on the heels of March 1st, weakened government, European and international community not too happy about what went on with March 1st. And all of a sudden, there's this Turkish-Armenia football diplomacy and a bunch of other things going on. And our focus changes. And now the international community accepts the legitimacy of Serge Sarkisian having come into power, with corpse in Republic Square and elsewhere, if you will. Here you have total calamity with the 44-day war, and what followed. I don't know if it's any better. It's certainly, equal, if not worse, when you have an entire country and all those villages that we have heard firsthand from the human rights defender of Armenia, having gone and visited, and we have followed, Karnig and I and others, that are in constant, threat for their safety, security, and whatnot. So all of a sudden, Turkey and Armenia are going to now have dialogue. Of course, we're all going to support the Republic of Armenia's efforts, but is it really going to go anywhere with so-called no preconditions? I'm a trial lawyer, and it's interesting. Every time I'm a criminal defense lawyer, every time I talk to a prosecutor, we start with no preconditions. But I want my client to be acquitted or charges to be dismissed against him or her. And the prosecutor wants to get jail time, prison time, and conviction. And those conditions that are not preconditions when we start talking, soon enough, they'll come up. And so there's no such thing as no preconditions. And as a diasporan Armenian born in the Middle East, having seen and lived this concept of Artsakh Armenia diaspora as one Armenian nation, then seeing Armenia, the guarantor of Artsakh, really not being anything close to being the guarantor of Artsakh, now going into talks with Turkey that sent mercenaries there. Yes, we should talk, but let's not be naive about no preconditions. And that poor gentleman, and I'm not going to give his name, who's probably all of 30 some odd years of age, up against Çavuşoğlu, who probably has 30 some odd years of professional experience. It's very troubling. It's very troubling. Yes, of course, we're going to support the Republic of Armenia's efforts in its negotiation with the Republic of Turkey, but nobody's fooling anybody here. And on this roundabout, if you will, Republic of Turkey is not exactly doing very well either with its economy. So they have every incentive. If only, Irina, we can have skilled negotiators on behalf of Republic of Armenia to bring that level that you referred to that starts here to really where it should be here. I think I just rambled on, but I had to say it was just really bugging me. I don't know if you disagree with what I said, Irina, but I'm I'm no politician and I'm no diplomat. I'm just really concerned about what lies ahead.
No, got it. I definitely echo your sentiment on this. I think what in Armenia's position, and in fact, you skipped Kocharyan's period, but although he wasn't aggressively pursuing any type of normalization, the foreign policy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the time did not necessarily fundamentally change. At the time, it was Vartan Oskanyan, and he was very clear about engaging in any type of dialogue with Turkey. And the objective reality is that Turkish Republic is based, and the identity of the Turkish Republic, and by default of the Turkish nation today, is part and parcel, or the element of that identity is denialism of what had transpired in 1915 at the time of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Mm-hmm. So we need to be objective in understanding that the very foundations of modern day Turkey is to deny Armenian genocide. And with that understanding, we need to assess, do we keep the borders closed and the dialogue non-existent, or do we engage in a dialogue and gradually showcase what had transpired and during that period? I think the latter option is more realistic if we want to finally achieve the recognition from Turkey itself, which is, something from a sci-fi genre. But I strongly believe, because I did have an experience, I was invited to a couple of universities in Istanbul to discuss this very issue. It was Koç University at the time. And I was telling about my personal story. I'm a descendant of Armenian genocide survivors. My roots go back to Van. And I was telling the very tragic story of my family, how they survived, how very few of them survived and ended up in Eastern Armenia, and how by default the fates of the Armenian diaspora and those who live in Armenia were devised or destined to be always part and parcel of what had transpired in 1915. There was a Turkish audience. They were listening to my position. They were asking questions. So I think we have, in a larger scheme of things, whether Erdogan will remain or not, whatever the administrations will be in Armenia or in Turkey, we need to look at the objective reality that we have a fighting chance if we sit with them at the table and talk, as opposed to shut the door and never engage. That is the objective reality. And from my personal experience engaging in track 1.5, track 2 diplomacy, it does work, and there are opportunities and avenues to change the narrative and essentially the fundamental identity of a modern day Turkish Republic, which is based on the denialism of the Armenian genocide. So I think this should be the starting point for Armenia. But as I already mentioned, the current realities of substance are very, very unfortunate. And also another dimension. I mean, if before, when it was a period of football diplomacy, we negotiated with more or less democratic Turkey, today it's a dictatorship. We're surrounded by dictatorships. And qualitatively wise, it's a completely different ball game when you negotiate with a dictatorship. Not only right now, we're not in a position of power, but there's completely different rules of game for dictatorships as opposed to democracies. I think that's another dimension that Armenia has to be wary of, and when the United States and the European Union encourages Armenia and encourages this process, we say, thanks for patting us on our back, but just to remind you that the country next door is actually a dictatorship. So I think these are very objective realities that we need to be talking about, voicing, and keeping the world aware of what we're facing when it comes to dialogue with Turkey.
Irina, we're coming up on our hour, but I do want to ask you kind of a closing question, if I may, and that is, and perhaps it's too scripted, but I think it's kind of important. You are obviously an extremely articulate and intelligent individual, diplomat, expert, and the whole 9 yards. And with that, I think comes some forecasting responsibilities. And I think what I'd like to ask you is, what do you believe are the 2 or 3 main challenges that you would expect or want to see happen in Armenian political culture? And I don't mean necessarily from the government, but what are the trends? What are the areas in which you'd like to see more focus, more activism, in order to provide for a more secure Armenia? What areas are you focused on besides your academic interests and professional interests in the environment? Just from a political science perspective, what is missing right now within the political, the Armenian polity that you would hope to see strengthen over the next year?
Thank you, Karnig, for this closing question. Absolutely, I think there are a few aspects that I want to be, that I I would focus on and I want to see happen in Armenia. First of all, we need to realize that Armenia's political landscape is very, very poor. And I reflect about this in my book. Unfortunately, for years, we've seen political mobilization not around ideologies, not around a vision or a strategy. We've seen political mobilization around individuals. And this is exactly what we've seen in 2018. This is what we saw in 2020. Again, in 2021, in the most recent elections in June. It wasn't about political ideologies, about strategy, about vision, about roadmap, about where this group of leaders is planning to take the country. It was around individuals. And I think this is where Armenia's political landscape and polity as such fails. What I really hope to see is in the next year or so, new political organizations, parties, to emerge that have a clear vision, clear strategy, a team, and who plan to take Armenia to a point B from where we are right now, and showcase us not a list of toasts. Oh, I want Armenia to have 5 million people, but a strategy of how we're going to get there, where are going to source finances. I think this is something that I really hope to see in our political culture to emerge, with our constituency to mature, to elect individuals who are not, to elect political powers, not because of certain individuals, but for the capacity they bring and the plan that they showcase to its constituencies. And the other dimension that I really hope to see some positive development, it is the relationship with diaspora. I think it has been fundamentally broken in the course of the war and after the war. There has been poor communication. It wasn't stellar to begin with, and I do hope that there will be a rethinking on an institutional level, on an individual level, on a community level of how we structure this relationship to be more efficient, more effective. How do we engage diaspora more efficiently beyond, the donations that we've seen, but more with the capacity that diaspora has that is certainly a lot more in capital value as opposed to the donations that diaspora is capable of sending to Armenia. So that is another dimension that I really hope to see, because bottom line, that is the human capital that we constantly need to be tapping in, bringing the expertise, engaging with from Armenia. Armenia's strategic communication needs to be improved with the help of the diaspora to project ourselves as who we are really in this conflict or as a country in this region, to the capacity that we need to be brought into the country when it comes to environmental management, public resource management, and other aspects of managing the country and the economy. So these are the two large scheme of things that I really want to see changing in the country, and I really hope that actually will happen.
Thank you very much, Irina. I hope that, first of all, I have to say that this was a very enlightening conversation on a lot of different points, and we do appreciate your taking the time with us. And we do hope that you join us again at some point in the near future, because I believe that we need to hear from people with the perspective that you bring, and obviously the acumen that you bring as well. And we appreciate that very much. And with that, I want to kick it over to Garo. If you have any final words, Garo.
I do. Of course, I want to start by thanking Dr. Irina Ghaplanyan for being our final guests for 2021. We hope to have you again with us in the year ahead, hopefully discussing much more optimistic driven developments. We wish you the best in the year ahead. And we want to make a short programming note while Dr. Irina Ghaplanyan closes the year with us. We will resume our new year in 2022, exactly a week from now, with Dr. Viken Hovsepian, who will be our first guest in 2022 in what appears to be a big lineup already shaping up in the year ahead. As for my closing remarks, my dear brother and friend Karnig and dear Irina, I'm going to give some remarks in two languages, our native tongue and in English. Նոր դարվա շեմին։ Մարդիկ ուրախ են նոր դարվա շեմին եւ շնորհավորում են իրար։ Իսկ ես հիշում եմ անցած ժամանակը ու դարին, հիշում եմ իմ գործած հորս, գործած բարեկամներուս եւ ընկերներուս։ Եվ այո, հիշում եմ Արցախյան պատերազմում մեր գործած հայրենակիցներին ու Բաքուի բանդերում մինչև օրս մնացած մեր քերիներին։ Եվ մաղթում եմ համայն աշխարհասփյուր հայության հոգու եւ մարմնի նորոգություն։ Dear viewers, we are closing our final broadcast of 2021, for me with much heartache and overwhelming emotions. With many losses due to illness, we are now looking at our nation, I am looking at our nation, that it did not resign to this existential suffering. But apparently, hearing official Yerevan, I cannot help but think that we are doing just that. We are doing what appears to be, at best, a vague and murky engagement with Ankara, with many, many things left unclear, and transparency clearly far from all of it. We as a nation, ladies and gentlemen, we need to look for enemies within. We don't need to look for enemies within, rather, but yet we must. What I mean is that we must start by taking a look within each of us for the enemy. First and foremost, within our own selves. The enemy within each of us is that we must first conquer, let me be clear, we must first conquer our own hesitations, our own trepidations, and our own consternations. About what? About Artsakh. We cannot turn our back on Artsakh. Not today, not ever. I am not going to want to hear anymore, Artsakh is a done deal, it's over, we can't do anything about it. There are well over 100,000 people living in Artsakh, and every one of them does not feel that way, does not think that way, because they are still there. They are still there. We cannot, no matter how far we are geographically, turn our back. Let me just say this. In 1898, a great Armenian revolutionary, Christopher Mikhaelian, said something that, oddly enough, a friend of mine just out of nowhere this morning sent it to me. I want to leave you all, until we meet again, with those words. I want to wish you, on behalf of Karnig and I, Karnig, if you don't mind, a healthy, safe, and happy New Year. Wishes for 2022 with this statement. The statement that is the English title of it, I could say, is, quote, there has not been a happy New Year for an Armenian person for a long time now. There has not been a happy New Year for an Armenian person for a long time now. These words in Armenian uttered by Christopher Mikhaelian in 1898 in Armenian. Hai hamar vahutse nor dari chga. Badrele hargavor kardesneri vara ais gam ein avazagabedi gamkov kedzvat sahmannere. Chնչել է հարգավոր այն աշխարհակրական ներգերը, որոնք մեզ բաժանում են իրարից եւ որոնք առհասարակ մշտական չեն, իսկ երբեմն շատ գարջադև են լինում, հարադև գրիվ, ահա թե ուր է մեր փրկության բանալին, չշեղվենք այդ միակ ճանապարհից. Happy New Year, շնորհավոր նոր տարի. Thank you.